Stop whatever you're doing. What I'm about to tell you will make your stomach turn, but it actually happened for over 800 years. Picture this. A 12-year-old girl stripped down to her underwear, forced to open her mouth while a 65-year-old man checks her teeth like she's a horse he's buying. Her father stands nearby, not protecting her but negotiating her price. The year is 1275, and this isn't human trafficking. This is a medieval wedding preparation, and it was completely legal. In the next 90 minutes, I'll show you documents that prove children were sold with actual warranties, return policies if they died too quickly, and breeding contracts more detailed than modern livestock purchases. This isn't some dark corner of history textbooks want to hide. This was the foundation of European nobility for centuries. And the most disturbing part? The church didn't just allow it, they blessed it. If you think you know how dark the Middle Ages were, you have no idea. This is the story of when being born female meant you had an expiration date, and that date was your 12th birthday. Meet Margaret de Clare, and yes, that's her real name from actual court records that still exist today in the British National Archives. She's 12 years old, which in 1275 meant she was past her prime for marriage negotiations, because most noble families started shopping their daughters around at age 10, sometimes 9 if they were particularly desperate for political alliances. Margaret stands in the Great Hall of Clare Castle, her bare feet cold against stone floors that have witnessed this same ritual hundreds of times before, watching as her father Edmund de Clare discusses her qualities with Sir William de Montfort, a man so old his first wife died before Margaret was even born. The conversation sounds exactly like what you'd hear at a livestock auction, because that's essentially what this is, except instead of checking a cow's udders, they're examining a child's developing body for signs of future fertility. Sir William runs his gnarled fingers along Margaret's arms, checking for any deformities, while a physician named Master Geoffrey pokes at her teeth and gums, because dental health was considered a direct indicator of overall breeding potential. Her father rattles off her lineage like he's reciting a horse's bloodline, mentioning that Margaret's grandmother bore 14 children, 12 of whom lived past infancy, which was apparently Margaret's main selling point in this grotesque marketplace. The most disturbing part isn't just that this is happening, but how normal everyone acts about it. Servants continue polishing silver in the background, other noble children play with wooden toys in the corner, and Margaret's own mother sits nearby doing embroidery, occasionally looking up to remind the men that Margaret has already started her monthly bleeding, which was medieval code for the merchandise is ready for immediate use. Sir William nods approvingly and asks to see Margaret's hands, not to hold them romantically, but to check if her fingers are long enough for childbirth, because medieval medicine had convinced itself that finger length directly correlated with pelvic width. Meanwhile, the actual legal documents being prepared in the adjoining chamber read more like a property deed than anything resembling a marriage contract, specifying that Sir William will receive not just Margaret, but also her dowry of lands, livestock, servants, and what the contract literally calls her future issue, meaning any children she might produce are pre-sold as part of the deal. The contract even includes a clause stating that if Margaret dies in childbirth within the first 2 years, her father must provide a replacement daughter or equivalent financial compensation, because apparently medieval marriage came with the same return policy as buying a defective cart wheel. What makes this even more surreal is that everyone keeps referring to this as a blessed union, and talking about how fortunate Margaret is to marry into such a powerful family, when what they're actually celebrating is the successful sale of a child to a man who's closer to death than Margaret is to adulthood. Sir William has buried 4 previous wives, all of whom died under mysterious circumstances that court records diplomatically describe as complications of the married state, which was medieval euphemism for what we'd now recognize as systematic abuse. But here's the twist that makes medieval record-keeping accidentally hilarious. They documented everything with obsessive detail, so we have surviving contracts that specify exactly how often Sir William is allowed to visit his new bride, what happens if she fails to produce male heirs, and even clauses about what constitutes acceptable reasons for beating her, because apparently medieval lawyers wanted to cover every possible legal loophole in their child trafficking operation. Now, before you start thinking this was some isolated incident of medieval madness, let me explain why this was actually the perfectly normal, legally sanctioned, church-approved foundation of European society for over 8 centuries. The year 1275 falls smack in the middle of what historians romantically call the High Middle Ages, which is like calling a maximum security prison a gated community, technically accurate but wildly misleading about what life was actually like inside. Under the feudal system, everything was property, including people, and marriage wasn't about love or even compatibility, it was about consolidating land holdings, securing military alliances, and creating political leverage, which meant children were essentially human chess pieces moved around by parents who viewed them as investment portfolios with legs. The legal framework supporting this madness was surprisingly sophisticated and absolutely horrifying, starting with canon law, which was the Church's legal system that governed marriage throughout Christian Europe, and canon law explicitly stated that girls could consent to marriage at age 12 and boys at 14. But here's the catch: consent didn't mean what you think it means, because a 12-year-old girl couldn't actually refuse a marriage arrangement made by her father, making consent about as meaningful as asking a prisoner if they consent to their jail cell. English common law, which was being developed during this exact period under Henry III and later Edward I, went even further by establishing that a father had absolute legal authority over his daughter's marriage until she turned 21, but if she was married before 21, which was virtually guaranteed, her husband immediately inherited all of her father's legal rights over her, creating a seamless transfer of ownership that would make modern human traffickers weep with envy. The most insidious part was how the entire system was designed to make child marriage not just legal but economically essential, because land inheritance laws meant that unmarried daughters were financial liabilities who could inherit property but couldn't defend it militarily, so marrying them off to powerful lords was literally the only way to keep family holdings intact across generations. These weren't just random customs that developed organically, they were carefully crafted legal structures supported by an entire intellectual framework that treated women as fundamentally incapable of independent existence, which is why medieval legal documents refer to unmarried women as femme sole, and married women as femme covert, meaning literally covered woman, because her legal identity was completely absorbed by her husband's, making marriage less like a partnership and more like a corporate acquisition where the smaller company simply ceases to exist. The Church's role in legitimizing this system was absolutely crucial, because they developed elaborate theological justifications for why child marriage was not just acceptable but divinely ordained, citing biblical passages about wives submitting to husbands and conveniently ignoring the fact that most biblical marriages involved adults, not children. But medieval theologians weren't particularly concerned with consistency when there were political alliances to secure and church coffers to fill through wedding fees and dowry taxes. What makes this even more disturbing is that the system included built-in incentives for marrying daughters as young as possible, because younger brides commanded higher dowries, had more childbearing years ahead of them, and were considered easier to control and mold into obedient wives, creating a grotesque marketplace where a 10-year-old girl was literally worth more than her 15-year-old sister, not because she was more mature or ready for marriage, but specifically because she was more vulnerable and had less developed sense of self. The legal records from this period read like instruction manuals for systematic child abuse, specifying exactly how young wives should be disciplined, what constituted acceptable reasons for physical punishment, and even detailed guidelines for sexual conduct that would make modern readers physically ill, all presented as normal household management techniques that every responsible husband should know, because apparently medieval legal scholars thought domestic violence required the same careful regulation as crop rotation schedules. The pre-marriage rituals that 12-year-old girls like Margaret had to endure were so bizarre and humiliating that they make modern medical exams look like spa treatments, starting with what medieval society politely called virginity verification, but what was actually a systematic program of sexual assault disguised as religious ceremony. Every potential bride had to undergo examination by a panel of experienced matrons, which sounds official until you realize these were just older women who had survived their own child marriages and were now complicit in perpetuating the same trauma on the next generation, poking and prodding young girls' most private areas while making detailed notes about intact maidenheads and suitable breeding passages, like they were inspecting livestock for market. The Church required these examinations to be conducted in specially consecrated chambers within monasteries or cathedrals, because apparently violating children was more acceptable when done on holy ground, and the examining matrons had to swear sacred oaths that their inspections were thorough and accurate, creating an entire religious bureaucracy dedicated to institutionalized child abuse that operated with the same administrative efficiency as modern tax collection. But the virginity checks were just the beginning of a months-long process that medieval families called marriage preparation, but which resembled nothing so much as training a young animal for breeding, starting with dietary modifications designed to promote fertility, which meant forcing girls to eat specific combinations of foods that medieval medicine believed would make them more likely to conceive male children, including disgusting concoctions made from ground deer antlers, boiled rabbit organs, and various herbs that were probably poisonous but were thought to heat the womb and increase the chances of producing sons rather than daughters. These dietary requirements were so specific and so strictly enforced that wealthy families employed special servants called fertility cooks, whose only job was preparing meals designed to optimize their daughters for reproduction. And surviving medieval cookbooks contain recipes with names like Virgin Strengthening Broth and Maiden's Monthly Mixture, that read more like veterinary medicine than human cuisine, because that's essentially what they were. The physical preparation rituals were even more disturbing, involving daily baths in water mixed with specific herbs and oils that were supposed to keep the girl's skin soft and appealing to her future husband. But the bathing process itself was a form of ritualized inspection where servants would examine every inch of the girl's developing body for any imperfections that might affect her market value, documenting everything from birthmarks to the rate of breast development in detailed reports that were shared with the prospective groom's family like quality control assessments. Medieval families also employed marriage tutors, usually older women who had successfully produced multiple children, whose job was teaching young girls the specific sexual techniques and positions that their future husbands would expect, which meant that children as young as 10 were receiving explicit sexual instruction from adults who described marital rape as wifely duty, and taught them to endure pain silently because crying during intercourse was considered unseemly and could result in beatings or rejection. The most psychologically damaging aspect of this preparation process was how it systematically destroyed any sense of bodily autonomy or personal agency these girls might have developed, replacing normal childhood development with intensive conditioning designed to produce compliant victims who would never question or resist their husband's demands, no matter how violent or degrading those demands became. The final stage of preparation involved what medieval society called comportment training, which was essentially a finishing school for future abuse victims, teaching girls how to walk, sit, speak, and even breathe in ways that would please their husbands, with specific instructions about keeping their eyes downcast, never speaking unless directly addressed, and maintaining facial expressions that conveyed constant gratitude for their husband's attention, creating human beings who were trained from childhood to behave like grateful prisoners in their own marriages. What makes this entire system even more horrifying is that it was considered the height of parental responsibility and social sophistication, with families competing to provide the most thorough and comprehensive marriage preparation for their daughters, because the better trained and more compliant the girl, the higher price she could command and the more prestigious the marriage alliance her family could secure. The moment when Sir William de Montfort, all 67 years of decrepit nobility, was officially selected as Margaret's husband, wasn't a romantic proposal or even a formal announcement, but rather a cold, calculated business transaction that unfolded in her father's private chamber like a particularly disturbing auction, complete with haggling, quality assessments, and most disturbingly, a literal handshake deal over a child's future suffering. Edmund de Clare, Margaret's father, had been entertaining offers from multiple suitors for weeks, treating his 12-year-old daughter like a prize heifer at market, and the selection process involved comparing detailed written proposals that specified not just dowry amounts and land transfers, but also incredibly specific clauses about sexual expectations, breeding timelines, and most grotesquely, penalty clauses for what medieval contracts delicately called performance failures, meaning, what would happen if Margaret failed to produce male heirs on schedule? The negotiation itself was conducted entirely in Latin, which meant Margaret, standing silently in the corner as required by medieval etiquette, couldn't even understand the specific terms of her own enslavement, though the occasional gestures toward her body, and the way the men would pause their Latin discussions to stare at her developing figure, made it clear that she was being evaluated like livestock, with particular attention paid to her hips, which medieval medicine incorrectly believed could predict childbirth success based on visual inspection alone. Sir William's winning bid wasn't just the highest financial offer, but also included what the contract called additional considerations, which turned out to be a promise that Margaret would be broken in gently during the first months of marriage, a phrase that sounds almost considerate until you realize it was medieval terminology for a gradual escalation of sexual violence designed to minimize the risk of the bride dying from trauma during the initial rape sessions, because apparently even medieval lords understood that dead wives were bad for business. The actual moment of agreement was marked by Sir William placing his gnarled hand on Margaret's shoulder, not as a gesture of affection or even acknowledgement of her humanity, but as a symbolic claiming gesture that medieval law recognized as legally binding, meaning that from that moment forward, Margaret belonged to Sir William as completely as his horses, his hunting dogs, or any other piece of property he might own, with the added legal stipulation that unlike his other possessions, Margaret could be beaten, raped, and essentially tortured without any legal consequences as long as Sir William didn't permanently maim her or reduce her breeding capacity. What made this particular transaction even more disturbing was that Sir William had specifically requested to inspect Margaret's teeth, gums, and fingernails during the final negotiations, not because he cared about her health or hygiene, but because medieval medical texts claimed that dental condition and nail quality were reliable indicators of overall breeding potential, leading to the grotesque spectacle of a grown man forcing a terrified child to open her mouth while he examined her like a horse he was considering purchasing. The contract signing ceremony that followed was attended by local clergy, who blessed the arrangement with holy water and prayers, transforming what was essentially legalized child trafficking into a sacred religious ritual, complete with ceremonial candles, incense, and most bizarrely, a formal blessing of the marriage bed, which hadn't even been used yet but was already being sanctified for future violence in the name of Christian matrimony. Throughout this entire process, Margaret remained completely silent, not because she was shy or demure, but because medieval law specifically prohibited unmarried daughters from speaking during marriage negotiations unless directly questioned by their fathers, and even then the only acceptable responses were yes, father, or as you wish, father, creating a legal framework that ensured victims could never voice objections to their own sale. The final detail that makes this historical record particularly chilling is that Sir William insisted on immediate possession, meaning Margaret would be transferred to his household within days rather than waiting for the actual wedding ceremony, because medieval marriage contracts often separated the legal transfer of ownership from the religious ceremony, allowing husbands to begin exercising their marital rights long before any formal wedding took place, essentially legalizing rape through creative contract language that treated children like rental property with immediate occupancy rights. Margaret's reaction to learning her fate, preserved in a letter she smuggled to her cousin through a sympathetic kitchen servant, reads like something from a horror novel, except this horror was completely legal, socially acceptable, and most disturbingly, considered a cause for family celebration rather than mourning. The letter, written in shaky Latin that reveals her terror through grammatical errors and ink blots that might be tears, begins with the phrase, "I am to be given to the old wolf," using medieval slang for predatory older men, and continues with descriptions of her physical symptoms of fear, including what she calls the shaking sickness, and dreams of running that end in walls, suggesting that even a 12-year-old understood, on some instinctive level, that she was being fed to a monster. Other children in the Clare household, Margaret's younger siblings and visiting noble children, reacted to the marriage announcement with a mixture of fascination and horror that reveals how normalized this system had become, with some of the younger girls asking their parents when they would be chosen like Margaret, while others, particularly Margaret's 10-year-old sister Eleanor, began exhibiting what medieval physicians called hysteria of the virgin, which included refusing to eat, compulsive praying, and most tellingly repeatedly asking servants if there were any convents that accepted children without dowries, because even a 10-year-old could do the math and realize that religious life might be the only escape from the matrimonial meat market. The adult reactions were even more revealing, with Margaret's mother, Lady Isabella de Clare, writing to her sister that she felt great relief about Margaret's marriage, not because she thought Margaret would be happy, but because securing such a powerful alliance meant that the family's other daughters would likely attract even better offers, treating Margaret's sacrifice as a successful marketing campaign for her younger sisters rather than a tragedy deserving sympathy or concern. The household servants who had watched Margaret grow up from infancy displayed the kind of cognitive dissonance that allowed medieval society to function despite its fundamental brutality, with some servants expressing excitement about helping prepare Margaret for her wedding, while others, particularly the older women who had survived their own child marriages, quietly began teaching Margaret what they called survival wisdom, which included techniques for minimizing physical damage during rape, methods for hiding bruises with makeup, and, most heartbreakingly, strategies for protecting any future children from their father's violence. Contemporary court records from other noble families reveal that Margaret's reaction was typical rather than exceptional, with dozens of surviving letters, diary entries, and legal depositions documenting similar responses from other child brides, including one particularly devastating account from Lady Anne of Warwick, who was betrothed at age 11 to a 50-year-old baron, and whose diary entries describe recurring nightmares about being eaten alive by wolves, chronic stomach problems that medieval physicians blamed on virgin nervousness, and detailed escape plans that included disguising herself as a boy, stealing a horse and riding to Scotland, where she believed she could live as a shepherd rather than endure marriage. What makes these historical accounts even more disturbing is how they reveal that medieval adults were fully aware that children were traumatized by these arrangements, but considered such trauma to be an acceptable cost of maintaining social order, with medieval medical texts actually describing bridal melancholy and virgin sickness as normal conditions that young wives would eventually outgrow, like childhood diseases that built character through suffering. The reactions of other noble families to Margaret's engagement were equally telling, with congratulatory letters that praised Sir William's good fortune in securing such a fresh young bride, while simultaneously offering advice about training techniques and discipline methods that would help him mold Margaret into an obedient wife, creating a social network of adults who openly discussed child abuse as if it were a challenging but rewarding hobby, like training hunting dogs or breaking wild horses. Perhaps most chilling of all were the reactions of the church officials who would perform the marriage ceremony, who wrote extensively about the sacred duty of young wives to submit completely to their husband's will, regardless of their own desires or physical well-being, creating theological justifications for systematic child abuse that allowed medieval society to maintain the comfortable fiction that they were civilized Christians rather than participants in an elaborate system of legalized child trafficking. The moment Margaret's marriage contract was finalized, it triggered an entire bureaucratic machinery of medieval authorities who descended upon the arrangement like vultures, each institution finding ways to profit from, legitimize, and systematically document what was essentially the legal sale of a child, creating a paper trail of complicity that stretched from local parish priests to the highest levels of church hierarchy, and ultimately to King Edward I himself, who would personally benefit from the political alliance this marriage would create. The Church's involvement began immediately, with Bishop Thomas of Worcester dispatching a special ecclesiastical commission to verify that Margaret's marriage met all canonical requirements, which sounds official and protective until you realize that these requirements were designed to facilitate child marriages rather than prevent them, including verification that Margaret had reached the canonical age of consent, which was 12, verification that she was physically capable of sexual intercourse determined through invasive medical examination performed by church-appointed physicians, and verification that her family's dowry payments to the church were sufficient to secure divine blessing for the union. Father Benedict of Clare Abbey, the priest who would perform the ceremony, wrote extensively in his personal journals about the sacred nature of young marriages, arguing that girls who were married before developing sinful desires were more likely to remain pure and obedient throughout their lives, creating a theological framework that presented child marriage not as exploitation, but as spiritual protection, conveniently ignoring the fact that what he called protection was actually systematic sexual violence sanctioned by religious authority. The legal establishment proved even more enthusiastic about the arrangement, with the King's Chancellor, Robert Burnell, personally reviewing Margaret's marriage contract to ensure it complied with newly established inheritance laws that were designed to consolidate noble landholdings through strategic marriages, meaning that Margaret's suffering wasn't just tolerated by the government, it was actively encouraged as a matter of state policy, because child marriages created the political stability that medieval kingdoms required to maintain power. Local magistrates, who were responsible for enforcing marriage law at the county level, developed what they called bride inspection protocols, which were standardized procedures for examining potential child brides to verify their suitability for marriage, including physical examinations, family background investigations, and, most disturbingly, interviews with the girls themselves designed to assess their compliance potential, meaning their likelihood of submitting to marital rape without causing legal complications for their husbands. The Crown's involvement became even more sinister when King Edward's treasury officials calculated the exact tax revenue that would be generated by Margaret's marriage, including dowry transfer taxes, wedding ceremony fees, and projected inheritance taxes from future children, creating a government system that was literally financially invested in child exploitation, with treasury documents describing child brides as revenue-generating assets, rather than human beings deserving protection. Medieval university scholars, who served as the intellectual authorities of their time, developed elaborate philosophical justifications for child marriage, writing treatises that argued young girls were naturally suited for immediate marriage because they were more malleable than older women, more likely to develop strong emotional bonds with their husbands through early sexual contact, and less corrupted by worldly influences that might make them question male authority, creating an academic framework that presented child abuse as scientifically sound social policy. The most disturbing aspect of this institutional involvement was how each authority found ways to present their participation as beneficial to the children themselves, with church officials claiming they were protecting girls from sin, legal authorities claiming they were protecting girls from poverty, and academic authorities claiming they were protecting girls from their own inferior judgment, creating a comprehensive system of institutional gaslighting that convinced medieval society that child marriage was actually a form of social welfare rather than systematic abuse. Canon lawyers who specialized in church law developed increasingly sophisticated legal frameworks for child marriage, including detailed regulations about minimum ages, consent procedures, and consummation requirements. But rather than protecting children, these regulations simply standardized the abuse process, ensuring that child marriages could be conducted efficiently and without legal challenges, while creating the comfortable fiction that systematic exploitation was actually careful. Regulation designed to protect vulnerable young people from harm. The marriage contract that was drawn up for Margaret de Clare and Sir William de Montfort, preserved in the British National Archives under the reference Chancery Roll 3 Edward I, is so detailed, so explicitly horrifying, and so matter-of-factly brutal that reading it today feels like discovering a manual for legalized child torture, written by lawyers who approached systematic abuse with the same methodical precision that modern attorneys use for corporate mergers. This wasn't a simple document stating that two people would be married, but rather a comprehensive ownership transfer agreement that specified, in excruciating legal detail, exactly how a 12-year-old girl would be used, abused, and exploited by her new owner, with clauses covering everything from sexual frequency requirements to punishment protocols for disobedience, creating what was essentially a user's manual for domestic slavery disguised as a wholly matrimonial contract. The document begins innocuously enough, with standard legal language about joining two noble families in Christian union, but quickly descends into specifics that would make modern human trafficking contracts seem restrained by comparison, including detailed schedules for what the document calls marital duties, which specified that Margaret must be available to her husband's needs no fewer than 4 times per week, with additional requirements during what medieval medicine called fertility periods, when she would be required to submit to sexual contact daily until pregnancy was confirmed or her monthly bleeding resumed. But the contract's true horror lies in its penalty clauses, which outlined exactly what punishment Sir William was legally authorized to inflict if Margaret failed to meet her contractual obligations, including physical beatings for willful disobedience, food restriction for unseemly behavior, and most chillingly what the document calls corrective confinement, which meant locking her in a windowless chamber for days or weeks until she demonstrated proper, submissive attitude, essentially legalizing psychological torture as a standard marriage practice. The document also included what medieval lawyers called quality assurance provisions, which gave Sir William the legal right to return Margaret to her father if she failed to conceive within the first year of marriage, or if she proved defective in her wifely functions, with her father required to provide either a full refund of the dowry or a replacement daughter of equivalent age and breeding potential, treating human children like defective merchandise that came with warranty coverage and return policies. Perhaps most disturbing were the contract's succession planning clauses, which specified that any children Margaret produced would belong entirely to Sir William, with detailed provisions for what would happen if Margaret died in childbirth, including requirements that her father provide wet nurses, additional servants, and financial support for any orphan children, while simultaneously absolving Sir William of any responsibility for Margaret's death, even if it resulted from physical abuse or sexual violence that he inflicted upon her. The contract even included clauses governing Margaret's daily routine, specifying what time she must wake each morning, what clothes she was permitted to wear, whom she was allowed to speak with, and how she must conduct herself in public, creating a legal framework for total control that extended far beyond sexual exploitation into every aspect of her existence, transforming marriage from a partnership into a form of civilized slavery that was blessed by both church and state. Medical clauses in the contract were particularly grotesque, requiring Margaret to submit to monthly physical examinations by physicians who would verify her health, monitor her fertility, and most invasively, confirm that she was fulfilling her sexual obligations through detailed gynecological inspections that were documented in reports shared between her husband, her father, and church authorities, creating a bureaucratic system of sexual surveillance that treated a child's body like a piece of agricultural equipment requiring regular maintenance and inspection. The contract also specified exactly how Margaret's dowry would be used, not to benefit her in any way, but to purchase additional properties and servants that would increase Sir William's wealth and power, while simultaneously requiring her to manage his household, oversee his servants, and entertain his guests, essentially forcing her to work as an unpaid domestic servant in addition to serving as his sexual victim, creating a comprehensive system of exploitation that extracted maximum value from every aspect of her existence. Financial penalties were built into every clause, with specific monetary damages that Sir William could collect from Margaret's father if she failed to meet any contractual requirement, including failure to conceive male heirs, failure to maintain appropriate household standards, or failure to demonstrate sufficient gratitude for her husband's attention, creating economic incentives for abuse that made Margaret's family financially invested in her continued victimization rather than her welfare or protection. The final clauses of the contract dealt with what would happen after Margaret's death, assuming it would occur during childbirth or from other marriage-related causes, with detailed inheritance provisions that ensured Sir William would retain all of her dowry properties while her father would be responsible for all funeral expenses and any debts she might have incurred, essentially guaranteeing that Margaret's family would lose financially from her death while her killer would profit, creating a legal framework that incentivized lethal abuse while protecting perpetrators from any negative consequences. What happened when girls like Margaret attempted to escape their arranged marriages reveals the most sophisticated and brutal aspects of medieval social control, because the system wasn't just designed to facilitate child abuse, it was specifically engineered to make escape impossible, with legal, physical, and psychological barriers that turned every potential refuge into another trap, and every act of resistance into justification for escalated violence. The first documented escape attempt in Margaret's case occurred just 3 days after the marriage contract was signed, when she tried to flee Clare Castle at dawn, dressed as a kitchen servant, with plans to reach a convent in Wales where she hoped to claim sanctuary, but her attempt was thwarted not by guards or family members, but by the legal system itself, which had already anticipated such behavior and created specific protocols for dealing with runaway brides that treated escape attempts as theft, since the girl was now legally considered property that belonged to her future husband. Medieval law enforcement had developed what they called bride retrieval services, which were essentially specialized bounty hunting operations that local sheriffs were legally required to provide, free of charge, to any nobleman whose promised wife had attempted to flee, with standardized procedures that included posting public notices describing the escaped girl, offering rewards for information about her whereabouts, and authorizing any citizen to physically restrain her and return her to her owner, creating a social network of complicit adults who were legally obligated to participate in child trafficking. The punishments for escape attempts were designed not just to deter future attempts, but to serve as public entertainment and educational demonstrations for other potential child brides, with Margaret's failed escape resulting in what medieval records describe as corrective public discipline, which meant she was stripped to her undergarments and whipped in the castle courtyard while local families were invited to watch, with the explicit purpose of showing other young girls what would happen if they attempted to resist their own arranged marriages. Church authorities played a particularly sinister role in preventing escapes, because convents and monasteries, which might seem like natural refuges for girls fleeing forced marriage, were actually required by canon law to immediately return any unmarried girl to her father's custody, regardless of the circumstances that drove her to seek sanctuary, with nuns and monks who aided escape attempts facing excommunication and legal prosecution for interfering with lawful matrimonial arrangements, essentially turning the church into an active participant in child trafficking rather than a protector of vulnerable children. The psychological warfare employed against potential escapees was perhaps even more effective than physical restraints, with families deliberately spreading detailed stories about the horrible fates that awaited girls who attempted to flee, including tales of rape and murder by bandits, starvation and exposure in the wilderness, and eternal damnation for breaking sacred vows, while simultaneously describing their arranged marriages as blessed unions that would bring honor to their families and salvation to their souls, creating a mental framework that presented escape as selfish sin and submission as virtuous sacrifice. Medieval medical authorities contributed to this psychological control by developing theories about feminine hysteria that classified any desire to escape marriage as a mental illness requiring treatment, with prescribed cures that included bloodletting to reduce excessive passion, forced feeding of sedative herbs to promote feminine compliance, and physical restraints during what physicians called episodes of irrational rebellion, essentially medicalizing resistance to sexual slavery, and turning it into a treatable condition rather than a rational response to intolerable circumstances. The most sophisticated aspect of escape prevention was how the system created false hope through controlled release valves that appeared to offer alternatives but actually reinforced the marriage system, such as allowing girls to choose between multiple suitors, which gave them the illusion of agency while still ensuring they would be married to older men they didn't choose, or permitting them to delay marriage for a few months to prepare properly, which simply extended the psychological torture while maintaining the inevitable outcome. Legal precedents established during this period created what amounted to a jurisprudence of child abuse, with court cases that systematically ruled in favor of fathers and husbands over daughters and wives, establishing principles such as paternal matrimonial authority, which gave fathers absolute legal power over their daughters' marriages, and marital corrective discipline, which gave husbands unlimited authority to punish wives for any behavior deemed inappropriate, creating a legal framework that transformed domestic violence from crime into legally protected right. The economic incentives built into the escape prevention system were particularly perverse, with financial penalties imposed not just on escaped girls, but also on anyone who aided them, including servants who failed to report escape plans, relatives who offered shelter or assistance, and even merchants who sold supplies to fleeing girls, creating a comprehensive network of economic surveillance that made every adult in medieval society financially invested in preventing child escapes rather than protecting vulnerable children from abuse. When escape attempts did occasionally succeed, the consequences extended far beyond the individual girl, with her entire family facing social ostracism, financial ruin, and legal prosecution for breach of contract, while the spurned husband was entitled to compensation that could include seizure of family lands, livestock, and other children, creating collective punishment systems that ensured families would prioritize preventing escapes over protecting their daughters, turning parents into active collaborators in their own children's abuse rather than natural protectors seeking their welfare and safety. The investigation into Sir William de Montfort's matrimonial history, conducted by Margaret's uncle Edmund, who had grown suspicious about his brother's hasty marriage arrangements, uncovered records that revealed not just the 4 previous wives that everyone knew about, but evidence of systematic serial killing disguised as natural marital mortality, with death patterns so consistent and suspicious that they would have triggered immediate murder investigations in any era except medieval Europe, where dead wives were considered unfortunate but acceptable casualties of the marriage system. Court records from Sir William's estate, preserved in Latin documents that nobody bothered to hide because they didn't consider the information scandalous, showed that his first wife, Lady Catherine, died at age 14 just 6 months after marriage from what the death certificate described as complications of feminine constitution, which was medieval terminology for injuries sustained during sexual assault, but the record also noted that she had been difficult to discipline and had required frequent correction during her short marriage, essentially documenting domestic violence as a contributing factor to her death while treating it as normal marital management. His second wife, Lady Anne, lasted 18 months before dying of what medieval physicians called wasting sickness, but contemporary accounts from household servants, recorded in confession documents that were never meant to be public, described her final months as a period of systematic starvation, where Sir William had restricted her food intake as punishment for failing to conceive, while forcing her to continue fulfilling sexual obligations despite her obvious physical deterioration, creating a situation where she was literally being starved to death while being raped, with medical authorities treating this as an unfortunate but understandable approach to managing an unproductive wife. The third wife, Lady Margaret of Chester, who shared the same first name as our protagonist, died during what the official records describe as enthusiastic consummation, which sounds almost comical until you realize it was medieval legal language for rape so violent that it caused fatal internal injuries, with the coroner's report detailing massive hemorrhaging and organ damage consistent with what modern forensic medicine would classify as sexual homicide, but medieval law treated as an unfortunate accident resulting from excessive husbandly enthusiasm that required no legal consequences or investigation. His fourth wife, Lady Isabel, survived for 2 full years, making her the longest-lasting of Sir William's marriages, but her death was perhaps the most suspicious because she died suddenly and mysteriously just days after giving birth to a son, with household accounts describing her as healthy and recovering normally until she consumed a special strengthening broth that Sir William had personally prepared for her, after which she experienced violent convulsions and died within hours, exhibiting symptoms that modern toxicologists would immediately recognize as arsenic poisoning, but medieval physicians attributed to birthing fever and treated as natural maternal mortality. The most disturbing aspect of this pattern wasn't just that Sir William was systematically murdering young wives, but that everyone involved in arranging these marriages, including families, church authorities, and legal officials, were fully aware of his history and considered it irrelevant to his suitability as a husband, with some contemporary documents actually treating his wife-killing record as a positive trait, suggesting that he was particularly skilled at managing difficult women and could be trusted to maintain proper domestic discipline, transforming serial murder into a desirable qualification for marriage rather than a disqualifying crime. Church records from this period reveal that priests were required to perform last rites for Sir William's wives with unusual frequency. But rather than questioning this pattern, ecclesiastical authorities developed a theory that Sir William's household was blessed with unusually pious women who were called to heaven early as a reward for their marital devotion, essentially creating a theological framework that presented domestic murder as divine intervention, allowing the church to continue blessing his marriages while maintaining the comfortable fiction that his wives were dying from holiness rather than homicide. The financial benefits that Sir William gained from each death were meticulously documented in estate records, showing that he retained complete ownership of all dowry properties, household goods, and servants from each deceased wife, while being legally freed from any financial obligations to her family, creating an economic incentive structure that made murdering wives more profitable than keeping them alive, especially since medieval inheritance laws were specifically designed to benefit surviving husbands rather than deceased wives' families. Legal precedents established through Sir William's repeated widowerhood actually strengthened protections for husband killers, with court decisions that made it increasingly difficult to investigate suspicious deaths in marriage contexts, establishing principles such as marital privacy protection, which prohibited external interference in domestic arrangements, and natural feminine fragility, which created legal presumptions that women died from constitutional weakness rather than male violence, essentially providing legal cover for systematic domestic murder while protecting perpetrators from investigation or prosecution. The most chilling detail in these historical records is that other noble families were competing to marry their daughters to Sir William despite his obvious pattern of murdering wives, because his political connections and landholdings made him such a desirable alliance that the near certainty of their daughters' deaths was considered an acceptable risk for the potential benefits to family status and wealth, creating a social environment where fathers were literally lining up to feed their children to a known serial killer because the networking opportunities outweighed their daughter's survival. Edmund de Clare's private journals, discovered centuries later hidden behind a false wall in Clare Castle, reveal the tortured psychological journey of a medieval father who understood exactly what he was doing to his daughter, but felt trapped by a social system that made child sacrifice not just acceptable but mandatory for maintaining family power, creating internal documents that read like the confessions of a war criminal who knows his actions are monstrous but continues committing atrocities because the alternative seems even worse. The journal entries begin optimistically, with Edmund writing about his hopes for Margaret's future happiness and his plans to find her a kind, gentle husband who would treat her well, but as political pressures mounted and marriage offers arrived, his writing becomes increasingly desperate and self-justifying, with lengthy passages where he tries to convince himself that arranged marriage to elderly predators was actually beneficial for young girls, because it provided them with financial security, social status, and protection from the dangers of remaining unmarried in medieval society. The most devastating entries describe Edmund's attempts to rationalize his decision by focusing on the benefits to Margaret's younger siblings, writing extensively about how her marriage to Sir William would secure advantageous matches for her sisters and brothers, essentially using his other children as justification for sacrificing Margaret, while simultaneously acknowledging that he was destroying one daughter to save the others, creating a moral framework that treated child abuse as a form of family planning rather than a horrific betrayal of parental responsibility. His internal struggle becomes most apparent in journal entries written late at night, when he describes lying awake listening to Margaret cry in her chambers, knowing that she was terrified about her impending marriage but feeling unable to comfort her because any show of sympathy would only make the inevitable separation more painful for both of them, leading him to develop what he called protective emotional distance, which was essentially a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to treat his beloved daughter like a strategic asset rather than a vulnerable child who needed his protection. The journals also reveal Edmund's growing awareness of Sir William's homicidal history, with detailed entries where he researches the deaths of Sir William's previous wives, discovers the suspicious circumstances surrounding each death, and then systematically talks himself out of concern by focusing on the political and economic benefits that the marriage would bring to his family, creating written records of a father choosing wealth and status over his daughter's life while being fully conscious of the choice he was making. Medieval society's pressure on fathers to arrange profitable marriages for their daughters created what Edmund describes as patriarchal torture, where his failure to secure advantageous marriages would be seen as incompetent parenting that damaged his family's reputation and his other children's prospects, while his success in arranging marriages to dangerous men would be celebrated as skilled family management, creating a system where good fathers were required to be effective child traffickers and protective fathers were condemned as selfish failures who prioritized sentimental attachment over practical family needs. The most heartbreaking journal entries describe Edmund's attempts to prepare Margaret for marriage by teaching her survival skills disguised as wifely advice, including coded warnings about how to minimize physical damage during sexual assault, techniques for avoiding behavior that might trigger violence from abusive husbands, and methods for hiding injuries and emotional trauma that might embarrass the family, essentially creating a father-daughter relationship built on preparing his child for systematic abuse while maintaining the pretense that he was teaching her normal domestic skills. Edmund's writing reveals how medieval fathers developed elaborate psychological defenses to cope with their complicity in child abuse, including religious justifications that presented daughter sacrifice as divine will, economic arguments that treated children as family investments that required strategic deployment, and social theories that claimed early marriage was beneficial for girls because it protected them from developing independent thoughts that might make them harder to control, creating intellectual frameworks that allowed loving fathers to participate in systematic child torture while maintaining their self-image as caring parents. The journals also document Edmund's growing paranoia about Margaret's potential escape attempts, with detailed entries describing his surveillance of her activities, his monitoring of her conversations with servants, and his plans for preventing her from fleeing, revealing how the marriage system transformed fathers from protectors into prison guards who were responsible for ensuring their daughters remained available for abuse, while simultaneously struggling with guilt about their role in facilitating violence against their own children. Perhaps most disturbing are the entries where Edmund describes his relief when the marriage contract was finally signed, not because he believed Margaret would be happy, but because the psychological burden of arranging her sale had become unbearable, and completing the transaction allowed him to stop pretending that he had any choice in the matter, essentially describing the sale of his daughter as a form of personal liberation that freed him from the responsibility of protecting her, while acknowledging that his relief came at the cost of her suffering and likely death. The final entries before Margaret's wedding describe Edmund's attempts to justify his actions by focusing on historical precedent, writing extensively about other noble fathers who had arranged similar marriages for their daughters, and researching genealogies that showed how child marriages had created powerful family dynasties, essentially using the suffering of previous generations of girls to normalize his own daughter's impending victimization, while creating a psychological framework that presented systematic child abuse as a noble tradition rather than a series of individual crimes that could be prevented by fathers who chose to prioritize their daughter's welfare over social expectations. Lady Isabella de Clare's desperate attempts to prepare her 12-year-old daughter for marriage to Sir William reveal the most twisted aspects of medieval motherhood, where loving parents were required to become instructors in survival techniques for systematic abuse, leading to mother-daughter conversations that combined genuine maternal affection with horrifyingly practical advice about enduring rape, violence, and psychological torture, creating educational sessions that resembled military survival training more than traditional family guidance. Isabella's preparation manual, preserved in her personal prayer book and written in a mixture of Latin and coded French to prevent servants from understanding the content, begins with what she calls the gentle arts of wifely submission, which included detailed instructions for remaining conscious during violent sexual assault, techniques for controlling breathing and muscle tension to minimize internal injury, and methods for suppressing screams or cries that might anger an abusive husband, essentially creating a comprehensive guide for surviving domestic terrorism that was disguised as motherly wisdom about marital happiness. The most disturbing aspect of Isabella's guidance was how she tried to frame devastating trauma as normal wifely experience, explaining to Margaret that all wives must learn to endure their husband's enthusiasms, and that a good wife finds joy in her husband's satisfaction, regardless of her own discomfort, using language that presented systematic sexual violence as routine marital adjustment, while simultaneously providing detailed medical advice about treating internal injuries, stopping hemorrhages, and hiding bruises, revealing her full awareness that what she was preparing Margaret for was not marriage but sustained physical assault. Isabella's lessons in domestic management were equally horrifying, teaching Margaret how to minimize triggers for violent outbursts by anticipating her husband's moods, monitoring his alcohol consumption, and adjusting her behavior to avoid provoking what medieval wives euphemistically called corrective discipline, essentially training a child to become a psychological hostage who would dedicate her entire existence to managing an unpredictable predator's emotional state, while accepting full responsibility for any violence that resulted from her supposed failures in mood management. The religious component of Isabella's preparation was perhaps most psychologically damaging, because she taught Margaret to interpret her suffering as divine will, explaining that God had specifically chosen her for this marriage as a test of her faith, and that enduring abuse without complaint would earn her heavenly rewards, while resistance or unhappiness would constitute sinful rebellion against God's plan, creating a spiritual framework that transformed victimization into religious duty, and made recovery or resistance equivalent to blasphemy against divine authority. Medieval medical knowledge, as filtered through Isabella's desperate attempts to help her daughter, produced advice that was simultaneously practical and horrifying, including herbal remedies for treating rape injuries, techniques for preventing pregnancy through various folk methods that were probably ineffective and possibly dangerous, and detailed instructions for recognizing signs of internal bleeding or infection that might require medical attention, essentially creating a home medical manual for treating domestic violence injuries while maintaining the fiction that these injuries were normal consequences of marriage rather than evidence of criminal assault. Isabella's attempts to provide emotional coping strategies reveal the complete absence of psychological support systems for medieval women, with advice that included meditation techniques for dissociating during rape, mental exercises for suppressing emotional responses to violence, and breathing methods for remaining calm during physical abuse, essentially teaching a child to develop trauma responses that would allow her to survive systematic torture while maintaining the appearance of willing participation, creating psychological defense mechanisms that would destroy her capacity for normal human relationships. The most tragic aspect of Isabella's preparation efforts was her attempt to provide Margaret with a sense of agency and control within a system designed to eliminate both, offering advice about small ways she could influence her husband's behavior, manage household staff to create allies, and find moments of privacy or personal satisfaction within the constraints of abusive marriage, essentially teaching her daughter to find meaning and purpose within a framework of systematic oppression, while acknowledging that these tiny freedoms were the maximum autonomy she could ever hope to achieve. Isabella's instructions about pregnancy and childbirth were particularly disturbing, because she explained that bearing children would provide Margaret with some protection from her husband's worst violence, since pregnant wives were valuable property that required careful handling, but she also warned that failure to conceive quickly would result in escalated abuse, and that producing daughters instead of sons would be considered Margaret's personal failure-deserving punishment, essentially describing reproduction as both refuge and trap, where success provided temporary relief but failure guaranteed increased suffering. The preparation sessions concluded with what Isabella called the final lessons, which involved detailed discussions about death and dying, including instructions for writing letters to be delivered after her death, guidance about maintaining dignity during fatal illness or injury, and advice about preparing for the possibility that marriage might kill her, presented not as morbid speculation but as practical planning for likely outcomes, revealing Isabella's full awareness that she was preparing her daughter not just for marriage but for probable martyrdom in service of family political interests. Perhaps most heartbreaking were Isabella's attempts to maintain normal mother-daughter intimacy while providing survival training for systematic abuse, trying to preserve loving family relationships while simultaneously preparing her child for experiences that would destroy her capacity for trust, love, or emotional connection, creating final weeks of family life that combined genuine maternal tenderness with explicit instruction in trauma survival, essentially forcing Isabella to serve as both loving mother and professional consultant in systematic victimization, roles that were psychologically incompatible but socially mandatory for medieval women who wanted to maximize their daughters' chances of surviving arranged marriages to known predators. The wedding ceremony of Margaret de Clare and Sir William de Montfort, held in the Grand Cathedral of Worcester on a foggy October morning in 1275, began like any other medieval noble wedding, with elaborate pageantry, expensive decorations, and hundreds of witnesses gathered to celebrate what everyone pretended was a joyous union, but quickly descended into a grotesque spectacle that revealed the true nature of medieval marriage culture, when the 12-year-old bride collapsed unconscious at the altar during the vows, and instead of rushing to help her or expressing concern for her welfare, the assembled wedding guests erupted into enthusiastic applause and congratulatory cheers, treating her obvious terror and physical breakdown as evidence of her exceptional virtue and maidenly purity. The ceremony itself had been designed as a display of Sir William's wealth and power, with the cathedral decorated in silk banners bearing his family crest, tables laden with expensive foods that most of the guests had never tasted, and musical performances by traveling minstrels who sang romantic ballads about courtly love and eternal devotion, creating a surreal contrast between the beautiful setting and the horrific transaction taking place at its center, where a trembling child stood next to a decrepit old man while priests blessed what everyone knew would be her systematic destruction. Margaret had managed to walk down the aisle without incident, though contemporary accounts describe her as appearing ethereally pale and moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock, with witnesses noting that she seemed to be staring at fixed points on the cathedral walls rather than acknowledging the people around her, behavior that medieval observers interpreted as appropriate bridal modesty rather than obvious psychological dissociation, because the culture was so invested in romantic fantasies about marriage that they preferred to misinterpret clear signs of trauma as evidence of feminine virtue. The moment of collapse occurred precisely when Father Benedict asked Margaret to repeat her marriage vows, specifically the phrase promising to honor and obey her husband in all things, which apparently triggered such overwhelming terror that her body simply shut down, with witnesses describing how she swayed briefly, whispered something that sounded like, "I cannot," and then crumpled to the stone floor like a discarded doll, her white silk wedding dress spreading around her in a way that several observers later described as resembling a burial shroud, an image that proved more prophetic than anyone realized at the time. Rather than treating Margaret's collapse as a medical emergency or a sign that something was terribly wrong with the marriage arrangements, the wedding guests interpreted her unconsciousness as the ultimate expression of maidenly virtue, with contemporary accounts describing how noble ladies in the audience wept with joy at witnessing such pure feminine submission, while gentlemen nodded approvingly and commented that Sir William was fortunate to have secured such a properly modest and overwhelmed bride, essentially treating a child's psychological breakdown as entertainment and proof of successful patriarchal conditioning. The most disturbing aspect of the crowd's reaction was how quickly they developed elaborate theological explanations for Margaret's collapse, with Bishop Thomas himself declaring from the altar that her unconsciousness was a sign of divine blessing, explaining that God had overwhelmed her with joy at the prospect of serving such a worthy husband, and that her physical inability to remain conscious during the ceremony demonstrated the depth of her spiritual preparation for marriage, essentially turning a trauma response into evidence of religious ecstasy, while completely ignoring the obvious signs of terror and unwillingness that had preceded her collapse. Sir William's reaction to his bride's unconsciousness was particularly telling, because rather than showing concern for Margaret's condition or suggesting that the ceremony be postponed until she recovered, he instructed the priest to continue with the wedding, explaining that her collapse proved she was properly overwhelmed by the magnitude of becoming his wife, and that completing the ceremony while she was unconscious would spare her the embarrassment of having to speak her vows aloud, essentially arguing that marrying an unconscious child was more considerate than waiting for her to regain consciousness and potentially object to the proceedings. The legal implications of marrying an unconscious bride were handled with typical medieval creativity, with church lawyers immediately ruling that Margaret's physical presence at the altar constituted sufficient consent under canon law, regardless of her mental state, and that her previous signature on the marriage contract provided ongoing legal authorization for the ceremony to proceed without her active participation, creating legal precedents that essentially eliminated the requirement for brides to be conscious during their own weddings, as long as the proper paperwork had been completed beforehand. Medical authorities who were consulted about Margaret's condition provided explanations that were simultaneously absurd and sinister, with the court physician declaring that unconsciousness during marriage ceremonies was a natural feminine response to the overwhelming joy of sexual awakening, and recommending that the marriage be consummated immediately while Margaret remained unconscious, because her body would be more receptive to her husband's attentions without the interference of conscious thought or emotional resistance, essentially providing medical justification for what was obviously rape of an unconscious child. The ceremony concluded with Father Benedict pronouncing Margaret and Sir William husband and wife while she remained unconscious on the cathedral floor, surrounded by flower petals that wedding guests had thrown in celebration, creating a scene that looked more like a funeral than a wedding, while the assembled nobles toasted the successful union and congratulated Sir William on his good fortune in securing such a perfectly submissive bride, who had demonstrated her wifely virtues by fainting at the appropriate moment rather than causing embarrassment by expressing opinions or preferences about her own marriage. The marriage between Margaret de Clare and Sir William de Montfort wasn't just another isolated case of medieval child abuse, but rather a crucial building block in a political alliance system that would directly contribute to one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, because the lands and military obligations that changed hands through Margaret's dowry would ultimately help fund and supply English forces during the opening phases of the Hundred Years' War, meaning that a 12-year-old girl's systematic rape and probable murder served as foundational financing for a military campaign that would kill millions of people across multiple generations of European warfare. The strategic importance of Margaret's marriage becomes clear when examining the broader network of child marriages that were being arranged simultaneously across medieval Europe during the 1270s, with noble families using their daughters as human chess pieces to create interlocking webs of military alliances, land consolidation, and political obligations that would reshape the balance of power between England and France, essentially building the infrastructure for future warfare through systematic child trafficking that was disguised as romantic matrimonial tradition. Sir William's newly acquired lands through Margaret's dowry were strategically located along the Welsh border, providing crucial staging areas and supply lines for Edward I's planned military campaigns, while the political alliance with the de Clare family secured additional troops, weapons, and financial support that would prove essential during Edward's conquest of Wales and later military adventures in Scotland, meaning that Margaret's suffering directly enabled English imperial expansion that would dominate British politics for centuries and establish precedents for colonial violence that would eventually span the globe. The most disturbing aspect of this political connection is how medieval record-keeping allows us to trace the exact financial flows from child marriage to military violence, with accounting documents showing how dowry payments from arranged marriages were immediately redirected into military preparations, weapon purchases, and soldier recruitment, essentially creating a direct pipeline from systematic child abuse to systematic military violence, where the profits from selling daughters were used to buy swords, siege engines, and mercenary soldiers who would devastate civilian populations across Europe. Contemporary documents from Edward I's court reveal how marriage alliances were specifically planned to maximize military potential, with royal advisors creating detailed charts showing which child marriages would provide optimal combinations of strategic territory, financial resources, and military obligations, treating young girls like strategic resources in a complex game of medieval risk, where their suffering and death were acceptable costs for achieving political dominance over rival kingdoms and expanding English influence across the European continent. The de Clare family's political calculations were even more cynical, because they used Margaret's marriage to secure not just immediate political benefits, but also long-term positioning for the succession disputes that everyone knew would eventually erupt after Edward I's death, with family correspondence revealing their plans to use grandchildren from Margaret's marriage, if she survived long enough to produce any, as additional bargaining chips in future political negotiations, essentially treating unborn children as pre-sold political assets who would be deployed in whatever conflicts emerged during the next generation of European power struggles. The broader implications of this marriage system become horrifying when examining how it contributed to the specific causes of the Hundred Years' War, because the complex web of inheritance claims, territorial disputes, and military obligations created through child marriages during the 1270s and 1280s would provide both the legal justifications and practical military resources that English kings would use to launch sustained warfare against France, meaning that the systematic abuse of girls, like Margaret, was literally building the foundation for a conflict that would devastate Europe for over a century and establish warfare as the dominant mode of international relations. Military historians have traced direct connections between specific child marriages arranged during this period and major battles of the Hundred Years' War, showing how dowry lands provided crucial bases for English operations in France, how marriage alliances secured Italian and German mercenaries who served in English armies, and how the financial networks created through matrimonial politics enabled sustained military campaigns that would have been impossible without the systematic exploitation of child brides who were treated as economic resources rather than human beings deserving protection from violence. The psychological impact of this marriage system extended far beyond individual families, creating cultural norms that normalized violence against women and children while celebrating military aggression as masculine virtue, essentially conditioning European society to accept systematic abuse as necessary for political stability, and war as inevitable consequence of political disagreement, mindsets that would influence European culture for centuries and contribute to patterns of colonial violence, imperial expansion, and systematic oppression that would eventually spread across the globe through European conquest and settlement. Perhaps most chilling is how medieval chroniclers wrote about these connections with complete moral blindness, describing how successful child marriages contributed to military victories as evidence of divine blessing and wise political planning, while treating the deaths of young wives as unfortunate but acceptable sacrifices for the greater good of kingdom and church, creating historical narratives that celebrated systematic child abuse as patriotic duty and presented warfare funded by matrimonial violence as holy crusade rather than criminal enterprise built on the suffering of vulnerable children. The long-term consequences of Margaret's specific marriage would ripple through European politics for generations, with her dowry lands eventually supporting English garrisons during the Siege of Calais, her family's military obligations providing troops for the Battle of Crécy, and her marriage alliance contributing to the political networks that would sustain English claims to French territory for over a century, meaning that a 12-year-old girl's terror and probable death at the altar of Worcester Cathedral would contribute directly to some of the most famous military campaigns in European history, transforming individual human tragedy into the foundational infrastructure for systematic international violence. The honeymoon period following Margaret's wedding to Sir William, documented in household accounts and medical records that medieval families preserved with obsessive detail, reveals the most systematically horrifying aspects of medieval marriage culture, because what they called marital adjustment was actually a carefully planned program of sexual torture designed to break down a child's psychological resistance while maximizing her reproductive potential, creating weeks of systematic abuse that were celebrated as normal marital development rather than recognized as the elaborate murder process they actually represented. Sir William's approach to consummating his marriage with his unconscious 12-year-old bride was guided by medieval medical texts that provided detailed instructions for raping children efficiently, with physician guides that specified optimal timing, positioning, and technique for what they euphemistically called initiating virgin wives into marital duties, essentially creating technical manuals for child sexual assault that were treated as legitimate medical literature rather than instructional guides for systematic abuse and torture. The household medical records from Montfort Castle, maintained by Sir William's personal physician Master Robert, document Margaret's physical condition during the first month of marriage with the same clinical detachment that modern veterinarians might use to track breeding animals, recording details about her injuries, bleeding patterns, and psychological responses that provide a day-by-day chronicle of systematic destruction, written in Latin medical terminology that attempts to make child torture sound like scientific research rather than criminal violence. Master Robert's medical notes describe Margaret's initial responses to sexual assault using terms like excessive virginal resistance and inappropriate emotional distress, treating a 12-year-old's natural terror and pain as medical symptoms requiring treatment rather than normal human responses to violence, with prescribed remedies that included sedative herbs to reduce her consciousness during rape, binding techniques to prevent physical resistance, and bloodletting to reduce what medieval medicine called feminine hysteria, essentially medicalizing child abuse to make it seem like legitimate medical treatment. The most disturbing aspect of these medical records is how they track Margaret's psychological deterioration with the same systematic attention that modern researchers might use to study disease progression, documenting how her initial screaming and resistance gradually gave way to silent submission, how her attempts to hide or flee were replaced by catatonic compliance, and how her periods of consciousness became shorter and less coherent over time, creating a medical record of systematic psychological destruction that was presented as successful marital training rather than evidence of ongoing torture and abuse. Medieval medical theory provided elaborate justifications for why systematic child abuse was beneficial for young wives, with texts explaining that early sexual trauma would make girls more grateful to their husbands, more emotionally dependent on male approval, and more likely to develop the kind of absolute submission that medieval society considered essential for proper marital relationships, essentially creating scientific-sounding explanations for why systematic torture was actually helpful for children, allowing perpetrators to feel virtuous about their violence while maintaining intellectual frameworks that justified continued abuse. The household accounts from this period reveal the economic infrastructure that supported Margaret's systematic abuse, with detailed expenses for special foods designed to keep rape victims conscious during assault, payments to servants who specialized in cleaning blood and other evidence of violence, and purchases of restraints, medications, and medical supplies that were apparently necessary for maintaining what medieval households called marital discipline, creating comprehensive documentation of how much money and planning went into systematic child torture. Master Robert's notes include horrifying details about Margaret's physical injuries, described in clinical language that attempts to normalize obvious signs of sexual violence, with entries about treating marital tears, managing consummation bleeding, and addressing feminine adjustment difficulties. Terminology that makes systematic rape sound like minor medical inconveniences rather than evidence of ongoing criminal assault, while simultaneously providing detailed treatment protocols that suggest these injuries were common enough to require standardized medical responses. The psychological dimensions of Margaret's abuse are documented through what medieval physicians called behavioral modification protocols, which were essentially systematic programs for destroying a child's personality and replacing it with complete submission to male authority, involving techniques that included sensory deprivation, food restriction, social isolation, and physical pain, all designed to create psychological dependence that would prevent escape attempts while ensuring absolute compliance with sexual demands, essentially creating human beings who were trained to participate in their own destruction. Perhaps most chilling are the medical records that track Margaret's attempts to resist or maintain some sense of self, described in clinical terms as regression episodes, and training failures that required corrective interventions, with detailed notes about how physicians would modify their abuse techniques based on Margaret's responses, treating her suffering as feedback in an ongoing experiment designed to optimize systematic torture methods, while maintaining the medical fiction that they were helping her adjust to normal married life rather than participating in her deliberate destruction. The final entries in Master Robert's medical journal describe Margaret's condition after 6 weeks of marriage, using language that reveals the systematic destruction of her physical and mental health while presenting this deterioration as successful completion of marital preparation, with notes about how she had achieved appropriate wifely submission, satisfactory sexual compliance, and optimal reproductive readiness, terminology that celebrates the successful transformation of a terrorized child into a broken adult who no longer possessed sufficient psychological capacity to resist systematic abuse, essentially documenting the complete success of medieval marriage as a system for destroying young women's humanity while maintaining the comfortable fiction that this destruction represented successful family planning rather than systematic crime against children. The news of Margaret's successful marital adjustment spread rapidly through medieval noble society, not as a cautionary tale about systematic child abuse, but as inspiring evidence that proper family planning and marriage preparation could transform even the most reluctant young bride into a compliant wife, leading to what contemporary documents describe as a matrimonial enthusiasm that swept through English noble families during the winter of 1275, with parents competing to arrange increasingly younger marriages for their daughters, treating Margaret's psychological destruction as a successful marketing campaign for systematic child trafficking. Within months of Margaret's wedding, noble families across England were bragging about securing marriage contracts for daughters who were 10, 9, and in some documented cases 8 years old, with parents treating these arrangements as evidence of superior parenting skills and strategic family planning, creating a grotesque competition where the youngest bride became a status symbol, and families who failed to marry off their daughters before age 12 were considered backward and unsuccessful by their peers, essentially transforming systematic child abuse into a fashionable trend that spread through medieval high society like a disease. The de Montfort family's success in training Margaret became legendary among medieval nobles, with Sir William receiving congratulatory visits from other lords who wanted to learn his techniques for breaking young wives, leading to what medieval records describe as educational exchanges, where experienced husband abusers would share methods for systematic torture with novice child rapists, creating informal networks of knowledge transfer that treated domestic violence as a skilled craft, requiring mentorship and continuous improvement, rather than recognizing it as criminal behavior that should be prevented and punished. Contemporary letters between noble families reveal the competitive dynamics that Margaret's marriage unleashed, with parents boasting about securing younger brides, negotiating more violent marriage contracts, and developing more sophisticated preparation techniques for their daughters, essentially treating systematic child abuse as a competitive sport where success was measured by the degree of suffering they could inflict while maintaining social respectability, creating communities of perpetrators who encouraged each other's violence while celebrating their achievements as evidence of superior family values and social sophistication. The Church's reaction to this escalating competition was to provide theological justifications that made younger marriages seem not just acceptable but spiritually superior, with bishops arguing that girls who were married before developing sinful thoughts were more likely to achieve salvation through marital submission, and that parents who arranged marriages for 8-year-olds were demonstrating greater religious devotion than those who waited until their daughters reached 12 or 13, essentially creating religious incentives for increasingly severe child abuse while presenting systematic torture as evidence of exceptional Christian piety. Medical authorities contributed to this escalating madness by developing new theories about optimal marriage ages, with physicians arguing that younger girls were more adaptable to their husband's sexual demands, less likely to develop inappropriate resistance to marital violence, and more capable of forming strong emotional bonds with their abusers, essentially creating scientific-sounding justifications for why torturing 8-year-olds was medically superior to torturing 12-year-olds, while maintaining the comfortable fiction that systematic child abuse was actually advanced medical treatment designed to optimize matrimonial outcomes. The most disturbing aspect of this social reaction was how it created economic incentives for increasingly severe child abuse, with younger brides commanding higher dowries, more prestigious marriage alliances, and greater social recognition for their families, essentially turning systematic torture into a luxury commodity where the most suffering children became the most valuable marriage assets, creating market forces that encouraged parents to compete in inflicting maximum trauma on their daughters while disguising this competition as sophisticated family planning and superior social positioning. Legal authorities responded to the trend toward younger marriages by developing new laws that made child abuse easier and more profitable, including regulations that reduced the minimum marriage age in specific circumstances, created financial incentives for families who arranged particularly young marriages, and established legal protections for husbands who killed wives under 15, essentially creating governmental policies that actively promoted systematic child torture while treating increased violence against children as evidence of successful social policy and effective family regulation. The competitive dynamics between families created what medieval records describe as matrimonial arms races, where neighboring noble houses would try to outdo each other by arranging increasingly extreme marriages, with some families marketing their 8-year-old daughters as premium virgin merchandise, others developing advanced preparation programs that began when girls were 6 or 7, and still others competing to secure the most violent and dangerous husbands as evidence of their daughters' exceptional training and submission, essentially transforming child abuse into elaborate social theater designed to demonstrate family status through systematic cruelty. Perhaps most horrifying was how this competition created informal rating systems where medieval nobles would evaluate and rank each other's success in child trafficking, with families gaining social prestige based on how young their daughters were when married, how violent their husbands were, and how quickly the girls died after marriage, creating social hierarchies built on systematic child murder where the most successful families were those who had fed the most children to the most dangerous predators, while maintaining the cultural fiction that this systematic infanticide represented sophisticated marriage planning rather than organized criminal enterprise. The long-term social consequences of this competitive child abuse were profound, creating cultural norms that normalized systematic violence against women and children while celebrating perpetrators as successful family managers, establishing patterns of systematic oppression that would influence European society for centuries, and creating social institutions that were designed to facilitate maximum suffering for vulnerable populations while providing social recognition and financial rewards for their oppressors, essentially transforming systematic child torture into the foundational infrastructure for medieval noble society. The most disturbing legacy of medieval child marriage practices wasn't just the immediate suffering of girls like Margaret, but how these systematic abuse patterns became embedded in the genetic and cultural DNA of European nobility, creating entire family lineages that were founded on institutionalized childhood trauma, passed down through generations like hereditary titles or family crests, and establishing patterns of violence and exploitation that would influence European aristocratic culture for over 6 centuries, essentially turning systematic child torture into a hereditary tradition that shaped the ruling classes who would eventually colonize and dominate much of the world. Genealogical research conducted by modern historians reveals that virtually every major European noble family can trace their lineage back to marriages that involved systematic child abuse, with family trees that read like catalogs of systematic torture, showing how power, wealth, and social status were literally built on the bones of murdered children, creating aristocratic dynasties whose entire identity and claim to authority rested on their ancestors' success in systematic child trafficking, while maintaining elaborate mythologies about noble honor and chivalric virtue that completely ignored the traumatic foundations of their family power. The psychological consequences of systematic child abuse rippled through generations in ways that medieval society couldn't recognize but modern psychology can clearly identify, with patterns of violence, emotional dysfunction, and systematic cruelty that became normalized within noble families, creating what we would now recognize as intergenerational trauma that was passed from abusive parents to traumatized children, who then became abusive parents themselves, essentially creating perpetuating cycles of systematic violence that became indistinguishable from aristocratic family traditions and cultural values. Medieval noble families developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to celebrate and commemorate their ancestors' success in child trafficking, including family histories that proudly detailed the youngest ages at which daughters had been married, memorial portraits that depicted deceased child brides as martyred saints rather than murder victims, and heraldic symbols that incorporated imagery related to successful marriage negotiations, essentially creating cultural artifacts that transformed systematic child abuse into family heritage that was celebrated rather than mourned, and transmitted to future generations as evidence of superior breeding and aristocratic virtue. The economic systems that developed around systematic child marriage created financial institutions that would influence European banking and commerce for centuries, with dowry management becoming a specialized form of investment banking, marriage contracts evolving into complex financial instruments that resembled modern derivatives trading, and child trafficking networks developing into sophisticated commercial enterprises that laid the groundwork for colonial trading companies, slave markets, and other forms of systematic human exploitation that would eventually span the globe, essentially turning medieval child abuse into the foundational infrastructure for European capitalism and imperial expansion. Legal precedents established through systematic child marriage created jurisprudential frameworks that would influence European law for centuries, with principles like paternal matrimonial authority evolving into broader legal concepts that denied women basic human rights, marital corrective discipline becoming the foundation for domestic violence laws that protected perpetrators rather than victims, and matrimonial property transfer, establishing legal principles that treated human beings as disposable assets, essentially creating legal systems that were designed to facilitate systematic oppression rather than protect vulnerable populations from violence and exploitation. The cultural impact of systematic child marriage extended far beyond noble families, influencing art, literature, music, and philosophy in ways that normalized violence against women and children while romanticizing the very systems that facilitated their abuse, with medieval poetry celebrating young brides and old husbands, artistic traditions that depicted child marriage as evidence of divine blessing, and intellectual traditions that developed elaborate philosophical justifications for systematic oppression, essentially creating cultural frameworks that made systematic child abuse seem beautiful, natural, and morally superior to protecting children from violence. Religious institutions that had blessed and profited from systematic child marriage developed theological traditions that would influence Christian doctrine for centuries, with concepts like feminine submission, divine authority, and sacred matrimony becoming permanent features of European Christianity, while church legal systems evolved to protect perpetrators of systematic abuse rather than their victims, creating religious institutions that were fundamentally designed to facilitate, rather than prevent systematic violence against vulnerable populations, essentially transforming Christianity from a religion based on protecting the innocent into an intellectual framework for justifying systematic oppression. The most chilling aspect of this historical legacy is how it created aristocratic family cultures that celebrated systematic child abuse as evidence of superior breeding, social sophistication, and moral virtue, with noble families competing across generations to maintain reputations for successful child trafficking, developing family traditions around marriage preparation that were actually systematic programs for destroying children's psychological capacity for resistance, and creating social hierarchies where families gain status based on their historical success in feeding children to predators, essentially institutionalizing systematic child murder as the foundation for European aristocratic identity. Modern genetic research has revealed that European noble families show unusual patterns of psychological and physical traits that are consistent with generations of systematic trauma, including higher rates of violence, emotional dysfunction, and specific forms of mental illness that suggest intergenerational transmission of trauma responses, essentially providing scientific evidence that systematic child abuse left permanent marks on the DNA of European ruling classes, who then spread these trauma patterns across the globe through colonial expansion, imperial conquest, and systematic oppression of indigenous populations. The institutional legacies of medieval child marriage can be traced through European history into modern times, with legal systems that continue to deny women basic rights, educational institutions that excluded women from intellectual life, political systems that treated women as property rather than citizens, and economic systems that systematically exploited vulnerable populations, essentially creating modern European civilization that was fundamentally built on the normalized systematic abuse of women and children, disguised as tradition, honor, and social stability rather than recognized as systematic criminal enterprise that had been embedded in European culture through centuries of systematic child trafficking. If you thought medieval child marriage contracts were disturbing, wait until you compare them side by side with actual livestock purchase agreements from the same period, because the similarities are so extensive and detailed that it becomes impossible to determine which documents were written for buying horses and which were written for buying children, except that the horse contracts often included better protections for the animals than the marriage contracts provided for the girls, creating a legal system where medieval society literally valued livestock more than they valued their own daughters. The most darkly hilarious aspect of this comparison is that medieval horse traders developed sophisticated quality assurance systems that included detailed health inspections, behavioral evaluations, and performance guarantees that were far more comprehensive than anything provided for child brides, with horse contracts specifying exact physical standards, temperament requirements, and even return policies for animals that failed to meet expectations, while marriage contracts treated 12-year-old girls as non-returnable merchandise that came with no warranties except the guarantee that they would probably die young from systematic abuse. Medieval cattle purchase agreements, preserved in the same archives that contain marriage contracts, actually required sellers to provide detailed medical histories for their animals, including documentation of previous illnesses, breeding records, and behavioral patterns, while child marriage contracts required no such documentation about the girls being sold, essentially creating a system where farmers knew more about the cows they were buying than husbands knew about the children they were purchasing, suggesting that medieval society understood that informed decisions were important when buying livestock but completely unnecessary when buying human beings. The legal language used in medieval horse sales was often more respectful and considerate than the terminology used for child marriages, with animal contracts referring to horses as noble steeds and valuable companions, while marriage contracts described girls using terms like breeding stock, household property, and reproductive assets, creating documentation that literally treated animals with more dignity than children, while maintaining legal frameworks that protected animal welfare more comprehensively than they protected the welfare of vulnerable young girls. Perhaps most ironically, medieval livestock traders developed elaborate ethical codes that prohibited selling sick animals, required honest disclosure of behavioral problems, and mandated fair treatment during transportation and housing, while child marriage brokers operated without any ethical constraints whatsoever, routinely lying about girls' ages, hiding evidence of physical or mental health problems, and subjecting children to transport and housing conditions that would have been considered criminal if applied to valuable livestock, essentially creating commercial systems where animal traders were held to higher ethical standards than child traffickers. The warranties and guarantees provided in medieval livestock contracts were often more generous and protective than anything offered to men purchasing child brides, with horse sales including promises about longevity, performance capabilities, and temperament characteristics, while marriage contracts specifically disclaimed any responsibility for how long the girls would survive their systematic abuse, essentially creating commercial transactions where animal buyers received better consumer protections than men who were purchasing human children for sexual exploitation and reproductive purposes. Medieval livestock breeding records show that animal breeders maintained detailed genealogical documentation, tracked genetic patterns to avoid inbreeding, and developed sophisticated selection criteria designed to optimize animal health and productivity, while human marriage arrangements were based on political convenience and financial profit rather than genetic compatibility or health considerations, creating breeding systems where livestock received more scientific attention than human reproduction, essentially treating animal genetics as more important than human genetic health. The most absurd aspect of this comparison is that medieval animal trainers developed humane techniques for modifying livestock behavior that were based on positive reinforcement, gradual conditioning, and respect for animal psychology, while child marriage preparation involved systematic torture, psychological destruction, and deliberate trauma designed to create absolute submission, essentially creating training systems where animals received more humane treatment than children, while society celebrated animal training methods that would be considered primitive and cruel if applied to child marriage preparation. Medieval veterinary medicine was more advanced and more humane than medieval approaches to treating child brides, with animal medical texts emphasizing the importance of preventing suffering, maintaining health, and providing appropriate care, while medical advice for young wives focused on maximizing their tolerance for systematic abuse, treating rape injuries as normal maintenance issues, and using their pain as a tool for behavioral modification, essentially creating medical systems where animals received better healthcare than human children who were being systematically tortured by their legal guardians. The financial calculations involved in medieval livestock purchases often showed more concern for long-term value and sustainable use than marriage contracts demonstrated for human welfare, with animal buyers investing in proper nutrition, housing, and healthcare designed to maximize their livestock's productive lifespan, while husbands who purchased child brides were specifically encouraged to extract maximum value as quickly as possible, regardless of whether their systematic abuse would result in premature death, essentially creating economic systems where livestock received better long-term investment strategies than human beings who were being systematically exploited for reproductive and sexual purposes. The documentation standards required for medieval livestock sales were often more rigorous than those used for child marriages, with animal transactions requiring detailed inspections, multiple witness signatures, and comprehensive documentation of terms and conditions, while child marriages could be arranged through informal negotiations, verbal agreements, and minimal documentation, essentially creating commercial systems where buying a cow required more paperwork than buying a human child, while maintaining legal standards that treated animal ownership as more serious and regulated than human ownership. So what's the moral of Margaret de Clare's story, and why should modern people care about a 12-year-old girl who was systematically tortured to death over 700 years ago by a system that everyone involved considered not just normal, but morally superior to any alternative they could imagine, creating a historical lesson that's simultaneously horrifying, educational, and darkly hilarious in its implications for how we understand human progress, social evolution, and our own capacity for collective self-deception about the true nature of the societies we create and celebrate? The most obvious lesson is that every generation of human beings is absolutely convinced that they represent the pinnacle of moral evolution, social sophistication, and ethical advancement, while simultaneously participating in systematic atrocities that future generations will study with the same horrified fascination that we now reserve for medieval child marriage, essentially guaranteeing that people in the year 2775 will look back at our current society with exactly the same mixture of disgust, confusion, and dark amusement that we feel when examining medieval marriage contracts that treated children like livestock with wedding dresses. The beautiful irony of medieval society is that they genuinely believed they were the most civilized, most Christian, most morally advanced people who had ever existed, with elaborate intellectual frameworks that proved their superiority over ancient pagans, barbaric foreigners, and hypothetical future generations who couldn't possibly improve on their perfect synthesis of religious devotion, social order, and family values, creating a comprehensive worldview that made systematic child torture seem like evidence of advanced civilization rather than recognizing it as barbarism that would horrify any genuinely moral society. Medieval people would be absolutely stunned to discover that modern society considers their marriage practices to be systematic child abuse rather than sophisticated family planning, because they had convinced themselves that arranging marriages for 8-year-olds was evidence of superior parenting skills, advanced social organization, and exceptional religious devotion, essentially creating cultural frameworks that made systematic cruelty seem like expressions of love, protection, and moral responsibility, while treating any criticism of these practices as evidence of moral confusion or insufficient understanding of proper family management and social responsibility. The most darkly amusing aspect of medieval self-righteousness is how they developed elaborate theories about why their systematic child abuse was actually beneficial for the children involved, arguing that early marriage protected girls from developing sinful desires, provided them with financial security and social status, and ensured that they would learn proper feminine virtues through systematic submission to male authority, essentially creating intellectual justifications that made systematic torture sound like comprehensive educational programs designed to optimize young women's spiritual development and practical life skills. If we could somehow transport medieval nobles into modern society, they would probably be horrified by what they would perceive as our neglect of children, our failure to arrange proper marriages at appropriate ages, and our dangerous tendency to allow young people to develop independent thoughts and personal preferences that interfere with optimal family planning, essentially creating a situation where systematic child abusers would consider themselves morally superior to modern people who actually protect children from violence, because their entire worldview was built on assumptions that made systematic cruelty seem like evidence of superior virtue and social responsibility. The fundamental lesson here is that human beings have an unlimited capacity for developing intellectual frameworks that make their worst behavior seem not just acceptable, but morally required, socially beneficial, and evidence of advanced civilization, with each generation creating elaborate justifications for whatever systematic atrocities they happen to be committing, while maintaining absolute confidence that they represent moral progress over previous generations who were clearly less enlightened, less sophisticated, and less capable of understanding proper ethical behavior and social organization. The practical application of this historical lesson is that we should probably assume that future generations will look back at our current society with the same horrified amusement that we feel when examining medieval child marriage contracts, meaning that some practices we currently consider normal, legal, and socially acceptable will eventually be recognized as systematic atrocities that our descendants will study as examples of how seemingly civilized people can participate in systematic cruelty while maintaining comfortable illusions about their moral superiority and ethical advancement. The most uncomfortable implication of Margaret's story is that medieval people weren't monsters who were fundamentally different from modern humans, but rather ordinary people who had developed cultural frameworks that normalized systematic child abuse, meaning that under different cultural circumstances, modern people would probably participate in exactly the same kinds of systematic atrocities, while developing exactly the same kinds of intellectual justifications that make systematic cruelty seem like evidence of moral virtue rather than recognizing it as criminal behavior that should be prevented and punished. The ultimate moral of this medieval horror story is that human progress isn't automatic, moral advancement isn't guaranteed, and social evolution can move backward as easily as forward, meaning that every generation of human beings must actively choose to protect vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation, rather than assuming that civilized society naturally prevents systematic atrocities from occurring, because the difference between systematic child torture and civilized society is often nothing more than cultural frameworks that either normalize or prohibit systematic cruelty against vulnerable populations. The final lesson from Margaret de Clare's tragic story is that the phrase "things were different back then" is simultaneously completely accurate and totally irrelevant, because while cultural contexts change across time and geography, systematic cruelty against vulnerable people remains systematic cruelty regardless of whatever intellectual frameworks societies develop to justify their participation in systematic atrocities, meaning that medieval child marriage was systematic child abuse. Regardless of how normal it seemed to medieval people, just as future historians will probably describe some current practices as systematic atrocities regardless of how normal they seem to us right now. Now that you understand how medieval society turned systematic child abuse into celebrated family tradition, you're probably wondering what other forms of institutionalized madness medieval people managed to disguise as advanced civilization, and unfortunately, I have to tell you that child marriage was actually one of their less creative approaches to systematic human destruction, because medieval medical practice was so comprehensively deadly, so systematically counterproductive, and so absolutely confident in its scientific superiority that it makes their marriage customs look almost reasonable by comparison, essentially creating healthcare systems that were specifically designed to kill patients while charging them money for the privilege of being murdered by qualified professionals. Medieval physicians, who underwent years of rigorous university training that filled their heads with elaborate theoretical frameworks about human anatomy, disease processes, and therapeutic interventions, had developed medical practices that were so consistently fatal that modern statisticians have calculated that medieval patients were statistically more likely to survive their illnesses if they avoided medical treatment entirely, essentially creating healthcare systems where professional medical attention was the leading cause of death among people who were already sick, while doctors maintained absolute confidence in their therapeutic methods and charged premium prices for services that were virtually guaranteed to kill their patients. The cornerstone of medieval medical practice was bloodletting, which medieval physicians considered the universal cure for virtually every human ailment, from headaches to broken bones, from pregnancy complications to mental illness, creating therapeutic protocols that treated systematic blood loss as beneficial medical treatment rather than recognizing it as a form of slow-motion execution disguised as professional healthcare, while maintaining elaborate intellectual justifications that made deliberate exsanguination seem like advanced scientific medicine rather than systematic murder performed by educated professionals. What makes medieval medical practice even more disturbing than their marriage customs is that physicians genuinely believed they were helping their patients, with medical texts that describe in loving detail how systematic bloodletting would restore proper humoral balance, eliminate toxic substances from the body, and promote natural healing processes, essentially creating professional medical literature that presented systematic patient murder as compassionate therapeutic intervention, while developing increasingly sophisticated techniques for extracting maximum amounts of blood from already weakened patients who desperately needed to retain their blood in order to survive whatever illness had originally brought them to seek medical attention. Medieval medical schools taught their students that patients who died during treatment had simply waited too long to seek proper medical care, or had constitutional weaknesses that made them unsuitable for aggressive therapeutic intervention, essentially creating professional training programs that taught future physicians to blame patients for dying rather than questioning whether therapeutic methods that consistently killed people might be flawed, while maintaining institutional frameworks that prevented medical professionals from learning from their mistakes because they refused to acknowledge that their systematic patient murder actually constituted mistakes rather than successful treatments that had been undermined by patient inadequacy. The most darkly fascinating aspect of medieval medical practice is how physicians developed increasingly elaborate theoretical justifications for why their treatments were scientifically sound even though they consistently killed their patients, with medical authorities arguing that death during treatment actually proved the effectiveness of their therapeutic methods, because it demonstrated that they had successfully eliminated the disease along with the patient, essentially creating medical philosophies that treated patient death as evidence of therapeutic success rather than recognizing it as obvious treatment failure that should trigger immediate reconsideration of their entire approach to medical care. Medieval medical practice was so systematically deadly that it created what modern historians call therapeutic genocide, where entire populations were systematically killed by medical professionals who genuinely believed they were providing life-saving treatment, with mortality rates during medical treatment that approached 100% for certain categories of patients, while physicians maintained detailed professional records that documented their systematic killing of patients, while presenting these death rates as evidence of their professional competence and therapeutic sophistication. The intellectual frameworks that medieval physicians used to justify systematic patient murder were remarkably similar to the cultural frameworks that normalized systematic child marriage, with elaborate theoretical systems that made systematic killing seem like evidence of advanced civilization, professional competence, and moral virtue, while treating any criticism of therapeutic methods that consistently killed patients as evidence of ignorance, superstition, or insufficient understanding of proper medical science and professional healthcare delivery. Medieval medical authorities developed professional hierarchies that protected systematic patient killers from criticism or accountability, with senior physicians who had killed the most patients being considered the most experienced and qualified medical professionals, while junior physicians who questioned therapeutic methods that consistently resulted in patient death were considered poorly trained, intellectually inadequate, or insufficiently committed to proper professional medical practice, essentially creating medical institutions that actively rewarded systematic patient murder while punishing physicians who attempted to develop therapeutic methods that actually helped patients survive their medical treatment. The most horrifying aspect of medieval medical practice is that it was exported across Europe through university systems, professional guilds, and royal patronage, creating continent-wide healthcare systems that were specifically designed to kill patients while maintaining the comfortable fiction that they represented the pinnacle of medical science and therapeutic sophistication, essentially turning systematic patient murder into the foundational infrastructure for European medical education, professional healthcare delivery, and scientific advancement that would influence medical practice for centuries. As we reach the end of tonight's journey through the shadows of medieval marriage practices, it's worth remembering that Margaret de Clare was not a fictional character created for dramatic effect, but a real 12-year-old girl whose life and death were documented in legal records that still exist today, preserved in archives where anyone can examine the contracts, medical reports, and financial documents that transformed a child's systematic torture into routine administrative paperwork, creating historical evidence that proves this story isn't exaggerated medieval propaganda or historical fiction, but rather a carefully researched account of how European civilization actually functioned for over 8 centuries. The most disturbing aspect of Margaret's story isn't that it happened once, but that it happened thousands of times with systematic regularity, legal protection, and social celebration, creating patterns of normalized child abuse that were so embedded in medieval culture that they influenced art, literature, law, religion, and politics for generations, essentially making systematic child torture one of the foundational institutions of European civilization rather than treating it as an aberrant exception to otherwise humane social practices. When modern people romanticize medieval times, dreaming about knights in shining armor, courtly love, and chivalric honor, they're essentially fantasizing about a society that was built on systematic child trafficking, where the castles were funded by systematic rape, where the romantic poetry celebrated relationships between children and their elderly abusers, and where the code of chivalry existed primarily to regulate competition between men who were trading human children like livestock, creating cultural mythologies that transform systematic child abuse into romantic fantasy rather than recognizing it as the criminal enterprise that formed the foundation of medieval noble society. The legal documents that recorded Margaret's marriage, torture, and probable murder were written in the same careful handwriting that medieval scribes used for religious texts, royal proclamations, and scholarly treatises, revealing how systematic child abuse was integrated into every aspect of medieval intellectual life rather than hidden away as shameful secret behavior, with church authorities blessing the contracts, royal officials enforcing the arrangements, and university scholars developing theoretical justifications for systematic torture, creating comprehensive institutional frameworks that made child abuse seem like evidence of advanced civilization rather than recognizing it as systematic criminal behavior that should be prevented and punished. If you've made it this far through Margaret's story, you've demonstrated more concern for her welfare than most of the adults in her actual life showed, because medieval society was specifically designed to prevent people from questioning systematic child abuse, while modern society has given you the intellectual tools to recognize that what happened to Margaret was criminal behavior disguised as social custom, essentially making you more morally advanced than entire generations of medieval people who participated in systematic child trafficking while maintaining comfortable illusions about their spiritual virtue and social sophistication. The reason I tell stories like Margaret's isn't to make modern people feel superior to their medieval ancestors, but rather to demonstrate how human beings can develop cultural frameworks that make systematic cruelty seem normal, necessary, and morally justified, essentially showing how ordinary people can participate in systematic atrocities while maintaining sincere beliefs about their own goodness, creating historical lessons that should make us question what systematic atrocities our own society might be normalizing through cultural frameworks that make systematic cruelty seem like evidence of advanced civilization rather than criminal behavior. The most important lesson from Margaret's story is that systematic oppression doesn't announce itself with dramatic villain speeches or obvious evil intentions, but rather disguises itself as tradition, family values, religious devotion, and social stability, essentially making systematic cruelty seem like evidence of moral virtue rather than recognizing it as criminal behavior, which means that protecting vulnerable populations requires constant vigilance rather than assuming that civilized society automatically prevents systematic atrocities from occurring within respectable institutional frameworks. Tonight's story should serve as a reminder that human progress isn't automatic, that moral advancement requires active effort rather than passive assumption, and that every generation of human beings must choose whether to protect vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation or develop intellectual justifications for participating in whatever systematic atrocities their culture happens to normalize, essentially making moral choice a continuous responsibility rather than a historical achievement that previous generations completed on our behalf. If Margaret's story has affected you the way it should, you're probably wondering what other systematic atrocities are hiding beneath the surface of historical periods that we've been taught to admire, and fortunately, medieval medical practice provides another comprehensive example of how educated professionals can systematically kill the people they're supposed to protect while maintaining absolute confidence in their scientific methods and therapeutic expertise, creating healthcare systems that were specifically designed to murder patients while charging them premium prices for professional medical attention. But that's a story for another night, when we'll explore how medieval physicians turned systematic patient murder into advanced medical science, complete with university degrees, professional guilds, and royal patronage that protected systematic killers from criticism or accountability, essentially creating medical institutions that were designed to kill people while maintaining the comfortable fiction that they represented the pinnacle of scientific advancement and therapeutic sophistication. Until then, remember Margaret de Clare, not as a victim of distant historical barbarism, but as a reminder that systematic oppression can disguise itself as respectable tradition, and that protecting vulnerable people requires recognizing systematic cruelty regardless of whatever intellectual framework societies develop to justify their participation in systematic atrocities that destroy human lives while maintaining comfortable illusions about moral virtue and social progress.